Okay, Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulillah. I want to first let you guys know that I haven't been feeling well for most of the week, and while I'm mostly feeling better now, alhamdulillah, my voice is not at the best. So the enthusiasm with which I can speak is it's very much hindered. So I had a few difficult decisions to make about how to wrap this up. So one thing I knew for sure was this. I already knew coming into this that I was not going to finish up by speaking about the First World War. And the reason for that, firstly, is that a few years ago, I went on a kind of lecture circuit speaking about the Muslim experience of the First World War. And I found that it's very difficult to do justice to that topic in anything less than 2.5 hours. So the First World War really deserves its own really in-depth coverage, though I can answer questions about it in the Q&A. I will mention it only briefly today, but it will not be the central focus of the conversation. So my thoughts were this. Do I speak about the era between the 1908 revolution that overthrew Sultan Abdul Hamid up to the First World War, or do I speak about the period immediately after the Ottoman defeat in the First World War, because the legacies of those two periods are both very important for the way that we understand the modern Muslim world today. So what I've decided to do instead is this. I'm going to speak about both the revolutionary era after the fall of Sultan Abdul Hamid, that is 1908 until 1914, and I'm going to speak about the period immediately after the First World War, and inshallah I will do both of them some justice. Perhaps I will do both of them poorly, so we'll see. Sultan Abdul Hamid is overthrown in a military coup. And for about a year, he remains in power with no power. So that means he remains the Sultan, but he is cooped up in a cage. But in 1909, he launches a counter coup, some elements from within the military. This is kind of difficult to explain, but do you guys remember how I went on a 20-minute rant last time about the military academies? How many of you remember that from last week? Okay. The overwhelming majority of the soldiers and the officers in the Ottoman army were not from the military academies. They were what you call rank and file. Like, they were people who had been recruited into the military very early on. Most of them were illiterate, could not read, could not write, but they had slowly progressed through the army. So they did not come out of the military academy system. The rank and file soldiers, who had a special name in Turkish, and I can't remember it right now, they were overwhelmingly loyal to Sultan Abdul Hamid. But the military academy graduates tended to be loyal to this revolt. Not universally, not all of them, but these are two broad trends that you find. When Sultan Abdul Hamid launched this counter coup, which he never took credit for, he never associated himself with it, but everyone knew that it was his fingerprints all over it. Now Sultan Abdul Hamid was officially overthrown. He was officially deposed. There's a quite touching scene written in a book called, I'll remember the name later, but it's basically about the Arabs who lived in Istanbul at this time. And there's a scene where Sultan Abdul Hamid rides the train that he helped build outside of Istanbul and gets his last glance at the city before he's exiled forever. In like 1906 or 1907, a Turkmen Arab from, I know those sound like contradictory terms, but it'll probably make sense later, but a Turkmen Arab from the Lebanese city of Tarablis, of Tripoli, walks into the military academy as a student for the first time. And his name was Fawzi al-Qawaqji. And in a book titled The Commander by the historian Layla Parsons, she quotes Fawzi al-Qawaqji. The book is about Fawzi al-Qawaqji. She quotes Fawzi al-Qawaqji in a very peculiar incident that he had in the military academy at that time. He said that in the dining hall, a group of students came up to him and his peers, and they told him, "We are the children of Turan. You are not, but we want you to know that we descend from Turan." Have any of you heard this term before? You know any of what I'm talking about? Okay. Turan is a region in Central Asia. And these people asserting that they were from Turan were making a statement about their Turkish ancestry. They were saying that we, this group of people, these officers, we descend from a very special region in Central Asia, and we all have common origin. And so Fawzi al-Qawaqji narrates that when they started telling us that they kept talking about this, that we are from Turan and we are from Turan, and Turan is this special mythical place, we started to telling them, we are the children of Qahtan. Right? This is what the Arab students started to say. But the reason why I mention that story is because Fawzi al-Qawaqji gives an insight into his first observation of Turkish nationalism. The first time that he personally experienced it. And the reason why it's a significant story is because prior to that point in his life, he had never heard anything like this before. So it needs to be said that Sultan Abdul Hamid had around him a plethora of Arab or Arabic-speaking ulama. And this was part of Sultan Abdul Hamid's system of rule. Something really peculiar about the Ottoman Empire. It was a multi-ethnic, multi-linguistic, massive empire that lasted hundreds of years. Of the dozens and dozens and dozens of grand wazirs that the Ottoman Empire had, I don't think a single one was of Arabic origin. Now, this is something that some emerging Arab nationalists began to identify as a serious grievance. How could it be that in an empire where close to 50% of the population, I mean, that's an exaggeration, but geographically and spiritually and politically half. You think of the empire as two halves, a Turkish half at this point and an Arabic half. How could it be that only one or no grand wazirs were of Arab origin? Now, on the flip side of this, the ulama were overwhelmingly of Arabic origin, right? So the picture that the Arab nationalists were painting was not exactly a fair one. Yes, the position of Grand Wazir maybe not something that they ascended to very frequently, but there were other very, very significant positions in governance that they ascended to all the time. But nonetheless, you are starting to see a tension after 1908 that you did not substantially see before then. Most of what I discuss right now about the period between 1908 and 1914 will follow the theme of Arabic-Turkish tensions. But before that, Bosnia is annexed by the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1909. If you recall, I mentioned last week that Sultan Abdul Hamid, over the course of his 27 or 28-year rule, never lost any territory. But 1 year after his after he is deposed, Bosnia is annexed by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now, the reason why I mention the Bosnian annexation is because when Bosnia was annexed, riots erupted in Palestine. Full-blown riots. And goods that had Austro-Hungarian stamps, crates of goods that had Austro-Hungarian stamps, were thrown into the waters of the Mediterranean. Now, the reason I mention that is because they saw the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or rather, they saw Bosnia as part of their country. This is really important to mention, especially for the younger people in the audience. You think to a Palestinian or to a Syrian or Lebanese or Jordanian or Iraqi or something that Bosnia is so far away, right? But they saw its annexation by Austria-Hungary as something akin to if America were to annex Quebec or Newfoundland or Nova Scotia. Like, yeah, it's far, but it's part of us. These nascent trends of Arab-Turkish tension, they existed before the overthrow of Sultan Abdul Hamid. Remember the timeline that I'm giving you so far. I said Sultan Abdul Hamid was overthrown 1908, 1909. Fawzi al-Qawaqji is in university 1906, 1907, and he's already hearing about children of Turan and children of Qahtan and all of these divisions that are emerging, right? So it was already there. But many people believed that the new regime that emerged as a result of the revolution was going to bring about a whole bunch of positive changes that was going to propel the Ottoman Empire into its glory, basically. It's going to return its lost glory. The Young Turk Revolution, that is the revolution that overthrew Sultan Abdul Hamid in 1908, their slogan was fraternity, liberty, equality. Not in that order. I think it was equality, liberty, fraternity, or something like that. Where did they get this slogan from? You ever heard this anywhere else? Yes, the French Revolution. This is borrowed straight from, unlike other elements, when we said the military academies, they took the kind of the general picture from the German trainers and things like that. But this was a copy-paste. They copied the French homework. They took the literal slogans. Now the thing is, if I say to you liberty and brotherhood and equality, those words mean something to you. To the Ottoman subjects of that time, those words didn't really mean anything. They sounded really nice. People got really excited about them. But there are hilarious instances that occurred where, a woman was taken to court for evading her taxes. And then in court, she said, "How can I still be asked to pay taxes in the era of liberty? How are we still paying taxes?" So to her, liberty meant liberty from taxes, right? All of these newspapers, remember Sultan Abdul Hamid had repressed the newspapers for a very long time. Dozens and dozens and dozens of newspapers started popping up all over the Ottoman Empire, and they began to enthusiastically debate what equality meant, what democracy meant, what freedom meant, what brotherhood meant, what all of these things meant. So in a sense, this was a really exciting time. And one of the most exciting aspects of this, and I completely missed it last week, so let me try to do it some justice now. In 1876, when Sultan Abdul Hamid first ascended to power, he had commissioned and approved a constitution that he went then and absolved 2 years later. The 1908 revolution reinstated the 1876 Constitution. So now the idea was, we have real rule of law, we have real justice, we have real accountability, and we have an elected parliament. In 1909, the Ottoman Empire had an elected parliament, a parliament that had representatives from Iraq, from Anatolia, from Greater Syria, from Palestine, from the Hijaz. All of these bodies were represented in this Ottoman parliament. It's an incredibly exciting time. And people do have a lot to be excited about. But I'll mention two things, 2 or 3 things that definitely brought sources of concern and fissures and cracks in the empire. The first is going to be a return to the subject of language. Why is it that the Arabs and the Turks found themselves with irreconcilable differences in the late Ottoman Empire? Think back to 2 or 3 weeks ago where I said, a state is an institution that possesses complete control over the use of violence. Why does a state have this complete control over the use of violence? So it can collect taxes for the purpose of delivering services. Which services? Depending on the size of the state, sometimes all services. There are some countries where the state delivers all of the services. There are some countries where the state delivers many of the services. This makes sense to everyone right now? Everyone understanding what I'm saying? Okay, good, because this is really, really important. What language should those services be delivered in? Keep in mind, the Ottoman Empire at this time has oodles and oodles of Kurdish speakers, Arabic speakers, Turkish speakers, Albanian speakers, Bulgarian, Greek. They have all of these languages. What language do you deliver your services in? If you are a telegraph service and you need to communicate with the communications authorities themselves, what language do you issue that communication? If they are health services, health records, what language should those be issued in? This is not a simple problem. Now, somebody in the audience, usually when I ask a question like this, a child would say something like, all of the languages. Deliver the services in all of the languages. How many of you studied French in school? Hands up. Of those of you who studied French, how many of you speak any French? Okay, that's my point. And that's with decades and decades of super advanced standardized education. Multilinguistic proficiency is super hard to achieve, except in like frontier regions where people live in those languages. So from the perspective of the imperial center, we need to hire people, this is Istanbul talking, we need to hire people who speak the language that we speak so that we can get things done. From the perspective of the people in the provinces, we need people who speak our language so we can take advantage of the services they're claiming to offer. Now here's another caveat that's worth considering. If you decide we are going to deliver our services in Ottoman Turkish, who gets all of the best jobs? Turkish speakers. Right? They're going to get all of the jobs in the bureaucracy. If you decide you're going to deliver the services in Arabic, who gets all of the best jobs? The Arabic speakers. This is not just about racism. This is not just about preferential treatment. This is a real problem that I'm identifying. And even now, 100 years later, I don't have a solution to this problem. It's not by accident that in India, they speak English as a medium of communication. Like every Indian politician speaks English. They speak English on their news channels, okay? Because every other language is largely perceived as divisive or exclusive. It's a terrible situation they find themselves in, but that's the situation. And so that is one major reason why you have this explosion of Arabic, Turkish tensions. Because as you increase the level of state services and you mushroom the bureaucracy, you will also inevitably end up hiring people to serve that bureaucracy. But you need to hire people who speak a specific language. Once they chose Ottoman Turkish for an increasing number of services, they have by default alienated tons of Arabic-only bureaucrats. Now, there were other issues emerging as well. Take, for example, the remarkable accomplishment that was the Damascus to Hijaz Railway. A huge, huge, huge accomplishment, right? We spent a lot of time speaking about that last week. And I didn't really hammer the point home as strongly as I would have liked, but I said at some point that the Damascus to Hijaz Railway is like a metaphor for the state of the Ummah today. Because it was the first and only successful large-scale pan-Islamic project, a project that included the entirety of the Ummah. On the other hand, we find that today the Damascus to Hijaz Railway is in ruins, much like our Ummah. Right? The thing that was supposed to unite us ended up dividing us, but there are a few reasons why it divided us. Again, it's really easy to look at history and say this person is a kha'in, this person was a munafiq, this person was a, like, it's easy to point fingers, but some of these problems were real difficult problems to solve. Okay, so here's one. What, again, was the main purpose of the Damascus to Hijaz Railway? Ostensibly, right? On the surface of it. What was the main purpose of it? Yeah, to help people, to make pilgrimage to Mecca safer and faster. So, prior to the rail, how did people go to Hajj? Camels, donkeys, horses, right? Hajj was super dangerous. There's a reason why, I don't know if they do this in Egypt. I have like some Egyptian brothers in the front row, so I don't know if they do this in Egypt. But in Palestine, when people would come back from Hajj, they used to sing them songs. There were special songs for the people that returned from Hajj. Is this a thing in South Asia as well? Do you have like certain traditions of things that you would do to greet people who have come back from Hajj? So the brother was saying that in South Asia, people used to meet, people who were leaving for Hajj used to want to meet with everyone beforehand because they didn't know if they were going to come back alive or not. Because when people went for Hajj, half the group died on the way there, right? Either from disease or oftentimes they were pillaged by Bedouin raiders on the way there or other like semi-nomadic bandits. Hajj was super dangerous. It was so dangerous that for centuries, it was the responsibility of the wali of a Damascus, the wali of a Sham. It was the responsibility of the governor of a Sham to accompany the Hujjaj for every single Hajj. Everyone. So if you were the governor of Syria, you took 3 months off of your job every year for the purpose of Hajj. That's how dangerous Hajj was. Because the governor of Damascus would have to go with his army, go with a huge army to protect the Hujjaj. There were tribes whose exclusive job was to protect the Hujjaj. And these tribes were largely based in the Arabian Peninsula. And they were mostly based in the Hijaz. And some of them were rooted specifically in Mecca itself. And one of those families was the family of the mayor of Mecca, you could call him, the Sharif of Mecca, Sharif Hussein. Sharif Hussein was devastated by the Damascus to Hijaz Railway. It broke him, and it broke his entire tribe. Because his income depended on the protection of the Hujjaj. And he's now been robbed of that income. Not only that, but Sharif Hussein was personally connected to Sultan Abdul Hamid. I've read conflicting accounts. Some people said that he hated Sultan Abdul Hamid. The more compelling accounts that I've read was that he actually was quite fond of Sultan Abdul Hamid, and his overthrow was something of a serious threat to Sharif Hussein. The new regime did not particularly like or care for Sharif Hussein. And then you have another issue. So you have Arabic-Turkish tensions as a result of language. You have Arabic-Turkish tensions as a result of this Damascus to Hijaz railway. Those tensions are really peripheral. Had history not played out the way that it did, nobody would have recorded the rumblings of the Sharif of Mecca. Like, had things not played out the way that they did, we wouldn't even be mentioning it, but we mention it and it's important because of the way that things played out. And then we have another concern that takes front stage in the heart of the Arabic-speaking world between like 1909 till 1912, and that's Zionism. So Zionism was already present in Palestine during the time of Sultan Abdul Hamid. Theodore Herzl tried to buy Palestine. Sultan Abdul Hamid refused. But this new power seems much less reluctant to allow Zionists to purchase land. And at this time, a debate emerges within Zionism of, can we achieve our goals? That is, can we achieve our goals of establishing a Jewish national home by adopting Ottoman citizenship? If we become Ottoman citizens, if we become Ottomans, and we support the Ottoman Empire, can the Ottoman Empire then fast track our path to a Jewish national home in Palestine? There were a group of students at Istanbul University, a group of Zionist students, who very much believed this. One of them was a law student named David Grun. And he was from the camp that believed that they needed to maintain their Ottoman citizenship, and that was the best way that they were going to advance the Jewish National Home Project. David Grun later moves to Palestine and Hebraicizes his name to David Ben-Gurion. If you don't know who that is, you've missed the punchline. So Zionism becomes a huge factor. And at this time, the Zionists, unlike in the time of Sultan Abdul Hamid, are able to buy large tracts of land. The Palestinian leadership of that time, such as Sa'd al-Husseini, Rawhi al-Khalidi, these are two very specific, very important parliamentarians at that time, are emphatic in their opposition to Zionism. And a moment, I've been asked before, like, what was the tipping point? What was the point of no return? What was the point where all confidence was lost between the Arabic-speaking part of the empire and the Ottomans? And the truth is, that tipping point never came. Okay, like if you want the big picture, even till the Ottoman Empire's final days, until its eventual collapse, the overwhelming majority of the Arabic-speaking regions of the empire remained loyal to the Sultan. They remained loyal to the Ottoman Empire till the bitter end, the overwhelming majority. But what was the most decisive blow to confidence in the Ottoman Empire? It is this. In my opinion, it is this event. 1911 to 1913, another Balkan War breaks out, and the Ottoman Empire is very busy fighting a multi-pronged war against Bulgaria, Macedonia, and they're fighting multiple powers, they're fighting the Greeks. It is an enormous war, incredibly bloody, super costly in terms of lives. At the same time, a group of Zionists pushed to buy a region of Palestine called the Marj ibn Amir Valley. Israelis today call it the Jizreel Valley. So, the owners of that land, the Sarsuq family, owned it or came into ownership of it way back when the Ottoman land laws were changed in 1858, and by hook or by crook, they managed to buy it for a few pennies. But we're talking about an area the size of Boston. Like, I don't mean a few houses. We're talking about an enormous piece of land. So the Zionists go to make a major purchase here. The Palestinian delegation goes to the Qa'im Maqam. Qa'im Maqam is like a regional administrator. Think like an administrator of a greater municipal district. Okay? And they go to the Qa'im Maqam named Shukri al-Asali, who was originally from Syria. And they said to him, like, you have to stop this, because they are going to displace thousands of indigenous inhabitants. Okay, they're going to be homeless. And this had already, similar things had happened many times. So by now, the Palestinians had figured out what the Zionist game was. Shukri al-Asali looks at this, and he says, this cannot proceed. Right? These people are going to be displaced. These people are creating a state within a state. Yeah, we need to stop this. So he communicates this to the High Port. I don't have a transcript of this conversation. I just have the result. But I imagine the conversation went like this. Shukri al-Asali sends a communication to the military regime to say, hey, there's a land dispute in Palestine. The Zionists are trying to create a state within a state. This cannot proceed. And the military regime probably looked at him and said, you're bringing this to us now? We are fighting 6 empires in the Balkans, and you bring this to us now? Do they legally own the land, the Sarsuqs? Yes, they legally own the land. Do the Zionists have the money to pay for it? Yes, they have the money to pay for it. Then we don't care. And the purchase goes through. And at that point, Shukri al-Asali himself, as well as a significant portion of not just the Palestinian leadership, but at this point, keep in mind that newspapers are spreading information all over the empire. Word of this spreads like wildfire. If you ask me for a single incident that created irreparable damage to the legacy of Ottoman rule in the Arabic-speaking world, this would be one of the straws that broke the camel's back. It would be one of them. A major, major one. Within Ottoman decision-making circles, the Balkan War brought about a very familiar Ottoman line of reasoning. Some in the Ottoman government thought, if we just give up Macedonia, if we just give up that region, maybe the great powers of Europe will leave us alone. You can copy and paste that sentence over the course of 200 years, include new territories, always with the same outcome, because the outcome is no, they will never leave you alone. Maybe if we just give up Crimea, they'll leave us alone. Maybe if we just give up Greece, they'll leave us alone. Maybe if we just give up Serbia, they'll leave us alone. Maybe if we just give up Bosnia, they'll leave us alone. Prior to this, the Italians invaded Libya, right? What the Europeans had called Ottoman Siberia. Even Libya was not spared. Maybe, okay, they gave up Libya in 1911. Maybe they'll leave us alone. A group of this group of military officers who were already committed nationalists, really Turkish nationalists, a particularly militant strand of that group saw this as a decisive moment. If we allow this democratically elected, we have a parliament now, we have all of these checks and balances, we have a Grand Wazir who is accountable to parliament. If we allow this to continue, these idiots are going to give up our empire. So in the same way that in 1908, they overthrew Sultan Abdul Hamid, a subgroup within the Revolutionary Committee walked into the High Port in 1913, led by a young man named Enver Pasha, who puts a gun to the head of the Grand Wazir and basically tells him, either your resignation or your brains are going to be all over this table. And Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Jamal Pasha go from being part of a military regime to a triumvirate who rules unchecked over the Ottoman Empire. And it is in that state, linguistically divided, economically bankrupt, and not yet ready militarily to confront the great powers of Europe, that the Ottoman Empire found itself barreling into the single biggest conflict in human history at that time. That is the lead up to the First World War. Like I said, I'm actually not going to speak at length about any of the events of the First World War. I'm not going to speak about the Balfour Declaration. I'm not going to speak about the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and I'm not going to speak about the Arab Revolt. In large part because they're very, in terms of our common knowledge, they're more well known than literally anything else I've said this evening so far. Right? When I say the Balfour Declaration, most of you know what I'm talking about. But most of you probably were not familiar with the Sarsouk land sale of 1911, 1912. So what I want to speak about is the world that emerged immediately upon the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Well, I don't want to say the collapse. The Ottoman Empire actually never collapsed. It was defeated in battle. But immediately upon the retreat of Ottoman forces from the Arabic-speaking part of the empire, two regimes emerged in what was once the Ottoman Empire. Throughout the First World War, the Arabs were divided between pro-Ottomans and anti-Ottomans. By the Arab Revolt onward, there had been this massive schism between those who joined the Arab Revolt of Sharif Hussein and his son Faisal, and among those who remained loyal to the Ottoman Empire. As for the Turkish-speaking part of the empire, the final battles of the war took place where? Not the final battles of the Ottoman front. The final battles of the First World War, where did they take place? Was it Germany? Was it the Netherlands? Was it? Where do you think, specifically? It's actually Palestine. The final major battle of the war was the Battle of Nablus. And it is in Al-Quds that the German general Liman von Sanders hands over the authority of the Ottoman army to Mustafa Kemal. And he says, take this army, take it back to Istanbul, and surrender. Like the war is over. The Germans have surrendered, so these are basically your orders. And there are scenes of chaos in Damascus, because now some of the Arabs in Ottoman uniform don't really know what's going to happen to them. They start to bleed into the local population. And this Ottoman army begins to unravel at some of the seams. But the core of the Ottoman army remains intact and marches all the way into Anatolia, takes root in Ankara, and the Ottoman army 15% of its officers being Arabic speakers becomes Mustafa Kemal's Turkish Republican Revolutionary Army. Mustafa Kemal uses the Ottoman army. I don't mean uses as a pejorative. I don't mean he abuses. I mean he makes use of this Ottoman army to resist the colonization of Anatolia. Meanwhile, in the Arabic-speaking provinces, the difference that had divided the Arabic speakers, that is pro-Ottoman and anti-Ottoman, no longer made sense because the Ottoman Empire no longer exists. For all intents and purposes, in the Arabic-speaking world, the Ottoman Empire no longer exists. So Amir Faisal, the son of Sharif Hussein, leader of the Arab revolt, I'm going like a little bit quickly because I presume that in the audience you know what I mean when I say the Arab revolt and Amir Faisal. I mean like Lawrence of Arabia's Arab revolt. Amir Faisal summons back to Damascus the final Ottoman parliament. The Ottoman parliament and all of its delegates who had served in the final Ottoman parliament in 1913, 1914, and the wartime parliament, I guess, they were invited back minus the Turkish delegates. The Turkish delegates are no longer there, but all of the Arabic-speaking delegates, they're invited back. And they form the Arab Kingdom of Syria, and the Ottoman parliament becomes the Syrian Congress. Now, when I say the Syrian Congress, it included Hijazi, Iraqi, Palestini, Lebanese. All of these nationalities were represented in this parliament. And in this parliament, you had the most, what's the word that I could find here? The broadest and most comprehensive expression of democracy that the Arab world had ever seen. Because on the one hand, you have representatives in the Syrian Congress like Abdurrahman Shahbandar, who is a quite well-known Syrian secularist. On the other hand, you have Sheikh Rashid Rida, who is a Salafi reformer. I need to pause and say, in 1911, Salafi meant something different than what it means now. It had like totally different, not totally different, but it had substantially different connotations from what you understand it to mean today. But anyways, Rashid Rida was in this parliament. Kamil al-Qassab, another alim of that time, was in this parliament. Muhammad Azzad Darwaza was in this parliament. You had like all of these liberal, secular, conservative, Islamic, pan-Arab, highly nationalist personalities all represented in this parliament. And one of the most hotly contested issues that was debated in the Syrian Congress, the right of women to vote. That was brought, look, he looks over at his mom. So that was one thing that came into the Ottoman parliament, the Syrian Congress very early on. And you had ulama represented on both sides of the debate. You had secularists represented on both sides of the debate. You had Palestinians on both sides of the debate. You had Iraqis on both sides of the debate. You had Syrians on both sides of the debate. Basically, every consistent division that you think that you could imagine to settle this debate, you'd say surely all of the ulama were in agreement, or surely all of the Iraqis were in agreement, or surely all of... No, it was chaos. It was an enormous debate. And in the end, Rashid Rida, who is actually a supporter of the women's vote, stands up to speak. Everyone goes silent. And Rashid Rida says, and I'm paraphrasing here, he says, clearly, the very fragile peace that we have among ourselves is at risk of bursting us into pieces if we accept this vote. So while I support the right of our sisters to vote, I do not believe that it is the right time to do this now. And so while the vote doesn't go through, it gives a radically different impression of the thoughts and sentiments of people of that time as it relates to that issue. Because this was also being hotly contested in Europe and other places, right? And so I find that story to be just like an interesting reflection of where things were at the time. Now, I will just say something before I kind of wrap this up. In the same way, look, subhanAllah, like human beings will never find a shortage of ways to divide themselves. Didn't I say earlier that the Arabs were resentful at the Turks taking all of these jobs because, this linguistic problem was a real problem and it meant that they don't have access to jobs that all of these Turkish speakers do, right? So surely, if everyone speaks Arabic, we don't have this problem anymore, right? But then you have writers like Muhammad Kurd Ali in Syria saying, all of these Palestinians are taking our jobs. All of these Iraqis that you've brought in, they're taking the jobs of good Syrians. We can't have all of these people in here. We should have them go back to where they came from. So subhanAllah, even though this parliament was made up exclusively of Arabic speakers at this point, you still had people who were capable of creating divisions, even on this small scale. Okay. So, how does all of this come crashing down? I love telling the story in a way that centers our experience. Because for a moment, it allows you to forget that while this is happening, the world continued to twist and turn. And while the Muslims of the Arabic-speaking provinces were debating the women's right to vote, and in the Masjid they were making dua for Mustafa Kemal al-Mujahid, who was fighting against the forces of colonialism in Anatolia. While all of this was happening, the great victorious powers of Europe were meeting in Versailles, deciding what to do with the former Ottoman Empire. Quietly, the Prime Minister of Britain, David Lloyd George, says to his French counterpart, I should pause here for a second and say, parts of the Arabic-speaking world were triple promised. The French were promised Syria, they were promised Lebanon. The Zionists, they were promised Palestine. And the Arabs were promised all of it. So David Lloyd George says to President Clemenceau, I believe his name is, he says, our friendship with France is worth 10 Syrias. That's a direct quote. I'm not paraphrasing there. That's what he said word for word. Which is that we would never betray France to fulfill our promise to these monkeys. And so they made it very clear that the Zionists would get their promise, the French would get their promise, the Arabs would not. In order to not just delay this, but to reverse this decision, Amir Faisal himself flies out to Paris to try to swing the tide in his favor. He brings with him the Palestinian, I can't remember his name, but he was a doctor as well. He's a very significant figure, but his name is escaping me right now. But he also brings with him the Lebanese Rustum Haidar. So they bring a pretty powerful delegation, a very compelling delegation to speak to the great powers of Europe. Doors are shut in their faces. Suddenly, these people that helped us in the Arab Revolt, the people that supported us in the war, suddenly they're not that important. Again, all of this sounds familiar to us, right? Like we should see these patterns coming with 100 years of hindsight. To them, they were still new to this. And so I'll introduce you to one of the most obscure chapters in this entire story. The Syrian Congress is alive, active, debating issues, but fully aware that the great powers of Europe are circling, and they are not happy with its existence. Amir Faisal departs to Paris in the hope of swinging the great powers of Europe in his favor. But in the same way that Mustafa Kemal wished to resist by force the colonization of his land, so too did his classmate, Yassin al-Hashimi. So Yassin al-Hashimi and Mustafa Kemal, when I say classmates, I don't mean that they went to school at the same time. I mean they were literally in the staff college together. In a group of 15 students, Yassin al-Hashimi and Mustafa Kemal were classmates. When the war ended, Yassin al-Hashimi, who was of Iraqi origin, made the decision to remain loyal to the Ottoman Empire. But when the war collapsed, Yassin al-Hashimi sent out word to Mustafa Kemal, his classmate, to say, I want to come join you. Mustafa Kemal had finished the war leader of the 4th Army, Yassin al-Hashimi leader of the 7th Army. They were of equal rank. Mustafa Kemal saw this. The Majnoon, like, is this guy crazy? He thinks, like, I'm going to bring in someone who will definitely be my rival in like 3 or 4 years. So he says, basically, we don't really have room for you in Anatolia. So Yassin al-Hashimi begrudgingly joins the Arab kingdom of Syria under his nemesis, Amir Faisal. The two men remain inextricably tied until the death of Amir Faisal. But I'm not going to tell you that whole story. I just want to tell you one thing. Because if you asked me, if you could travel back in time and go to any event to stop the Arab world from experiencing the disaster that it experienced, what would be the moment that you intervene? Where would you travel to? And that's what I'm going to tell you. That's going to be basically my closing note. Yassin al-Hashimi felt that Amir Faisal's trip in Europe was a waste of time. The Europeans will never accept you. Keep in mind, Yassin al-Hashimi and Mustafa Kemal were not born noblemen. They were not born from they were not from high-born families. They were lower middle-class trash. So they knew that no one would ever respect them were it not for the force that they had. They understood this. They were military men. Okay? For all of the things that I hate about Mustafa Kemal, I can say this. He understood the situation much better than those around him. And Yassin al-Hashimi also understood the situation very well. So while Amir Faisal is in Europe, Yassin al-Hashimi begins organizing a local resistance to resist against the inevitable French onslaught. Yassin al-Hashimi understands insurgency and counterinsurgency. Yassin al-Hashimi knew Palestine and Syria as a battlefield. He had just fought most of the First World War there. He had been at the Battle of Gallipoli. He had fought in Jordan. So he knew this landscape very well. So he begins organizing a local resistance organizations capable of repelling the French advancement. The British remain openly ambivalent to all of this. The French are very new friends to the British. For most of their history, the French have been their enemies. So the British, who are still in Syria at this time, invite Yassin al-Hashimi for lunch, simply to discuss what is happening in Paris at the time, and to discuss the current situation of Syria, and to express where the British currently stand. Yassin al-Hashimi goes to this lunch. He is arrested, dragged out of Syria into British-occupied Palestine and imprisoned in Ramleh. The movement for local resistance now evaporates. If there is anything that I could have done if I was a time traveler, you tell me, like, what's the point where you intervene? I would tell Yassin al-Hashimi, don't go to that lunch. That would be my intervention. That's the point where I really feel that whatever tools we had left at our disposal were never going to be enough. This is the qadr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but I spend a lot of time thinking about these things, and of course, I can't help but imagine what different decisions could have been made. And this is one of them. In May of 1920, the French basically tell the Syrians, surrender now or be crushed by the French war machine. The Syrian kingdom collapses. Amir Faisal flees, but there is a small symbolic resistance led by a general named Yusuf al-Azma. And Yusuf al-Azma takes whatever was left of this army that the Arab kingdom of Syria had amassed and takes them to the mountains of Maysalun to launch a final stand against the French army. And Yusuf al-Azma was also a graduate of the military academies. Yusuf al-Azma was the aide-de-camp. He was the chief of staff of Enver Pasha. He was not an idiot. He knew that this war was unwinnable, but because of his resistance, the books of Syria record that their country was not surrendered to the French without a fight, and he was martyred in that battle. After that, the French general Henri Gourard, rather than going straight to his new palace, makes a stop at the tomb of Salah ad-Din. He kicks his grave and says, "O Salah ad-Din, we have returned. Our presence here symbolizes the victory of the cross over the Crescent." When General Allenby of the British Army crosses into Palestine, he declares in front of the masses, "I stand here before you to say the Crusades are finally over." As for Al-Quds itself, the state of poverty in Palestine at the end of the First World War as a result of famine and plague was so devastating that when Al-Quds was surrendered, they did not even have a white flag to surrender with. And so, in December of 1917, أولى القبلتين وثالث الحرمين, the first of the two qiblas and the third of the holiest sites in Islam, was surrendered with a bedsheet. As for the great Mujahid Mustafa Kemal, he made a bilateral agreement with the French to recognize their rule over Syria so long as they recognized his rule over the Turkish Republic. The Turkish Republic realized something that the Arabs did not. So long as the Arabs continued to have minorities, Europe would always be willing to intervene in its affairs. And so long as the Arabs continued to hold on, at least outwardly, to Islam as a meaningful part of their identity, Europe will never leave them alone. And so, the new Turkish Republic was going to be void of two things. It was going to be void of Islam, and it was going to be void of minorities. Everyone became, to the greatest extent possible, officially Turkish. And he was right. He was right. Europe never intervened in Turkey that way again. Never again. As for the Arabs, they could never recover from the Ottoman legacy of constant, relentless, and never-ending European intervention. A trend that we see to this very day. In the 1930s, the British foreign minister, David Ormsby-Gore, I think his first name was David, but his last name is certainly Ormsby-Gore, he said, as he was preparing to retire from his position as foreign secretary, he said, and I'm paraphrasing, "It has always been a cornerstone of His Majesty's government to ensure the disunity of the Muslim world. We cannot have these people uniting." And the 100-year track record shows that they've been very successful. They have been very successful. It's hard to figure out a way to end off these stories on a good note. It is. So I will say this. Despite his best efforts, was Mustafa Kemal successful in erasing Islam from Turkey? Was he successful? Despite every tool he had at his disposal and the fanatical commitment that he had to this goal, he failed. We could see it in Turkey today. He failed. And despite all of the claims to the contrary, we always look at, we say, disunity, and there's a lot of disunity in the ummah. I have heard for 3 weeks the imam of this masjid cry over a land he has never seen, where they speak a language he does not speak, and where he has no ancestors. For all of their effort to disunite the ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, I am actually quite optimistic with the level of unity that we have managed to maintain in the face of that. We can be negative if we want, but in the face of not just state-sponsored, but an international conspiracy to ensure our constant and never-ending disunity, when you think of it like that, realize, mashallah, we're doing okay. We have survived. The ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam has survived. And it will survive. And more important than that, it will be victorious. I mentioned in a talk that I gave last Friday, I mentioned that a Zionist had reached out to me. And he said, if the Palestinians were to just recognize Israel, all of this would be over. I told him a multitude of reasons why that's not true. And then he began, telling me basically, look, Israel is very strong, the Palestinians are very weak, all of this is going to cost a lot of Palestinian life, blah, 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 blah. Like the typical argument. And so what I asked him was this: how long do you think Israel can continue existing as a Jewish supremacist apartheid state? 100 years? 1,000 years? He said, I don't know, maybe a couple of 100 years. Sure, why not? I said, great. Your job is to maintain the infrastructure of a garrison state. Cameras, machine guns, 20-meter tall walls, all of that for 200 years. My job is to tell stories. I just need to make sure that another generation knows the stories that I know. My job is to just keep a fire burning in the bellies of Muslims all over the place. So given those circumstances, I like my odds. I'm optimistic about the future. And I closed off by saying then, and I'll close off by saying now, and this is a Pashto saying, actually. It's not something I made up. The saying goes that they may have all of the watches and all of the clocks, but we have all of the time. It takes 100 years or 1,000 years. Every single inch of this ummah will be liberated. Of this, I am as convinced of that as I am convinced of Allah and Yawm al-Akhir. I have no doubt about this. So while I have not told you the most optimistic story or the most uplifting story, I encourage you to be optimistic. Barakallahu feekum for sticking with the 4 weeks of this presentation. I know it's been a lot of information. We have time for a question and answer. Jazakumullahu khairan.
Sorry, I did not attend the first 3 lectures. This was my first one. So I missed a lot of the context of what you were talking, but I found it very interesting. So if you were to recommend me a book or a documentary where I could get a better idea of what you just told, like the end stages of the Ottoman Empire and where all the divides started, where should I look for?
Okay, so for anyone who didn't hear that, it was asking for book recommendations. Would you believe me if I told you that the last 4 weeks are excerpts from, and wallahi I am not exaggerating, dozens of books. Like, so many. So what we can do is this. At the end of this, I could give you my contact information, and if you email me or message me on Instagram or something, specific questions, I could give you specific books. Like, I could give you a book about Zionist land policy. I could give you a book about Ottoman military academies. I can give you a book about Ottoman administration in the Mashriq. I can give you a book about Ottoman decision-making in Istanbul and the Arabs who live there. I can give you a book about Arabic-Turkish tensions. All of these are different books. Like, there is no one book that summarizes these things well. I'm sorry that's not a more satisfying answer, but...
Exactly. So I just want to add a point that, so all the lectures are available online.
Oh, I didn't know this, okay.
Go to the YouTube or Facebook or Instagram, Masjid al-Salaam. You'll be able to enjoy the experience. Okay, I just have that.
I just have a question about one of the Arabic-Turkish tensions. You were talking about the language one. I imagine that was probably an issue throughout the history of the empire. Was it like the new revolution that had promised like liberty and equality and all of that caused the Arabs to be a little bit frustrated that all the services were in Turkish, or was it kind of different previously?
No and no and no, because prior to the advent of the nation state, the Ottoman Empire was not delivering many services. They were collecting taxes and they were offering protection, but services were primarily delivered through things like awqaf. So there was no reason for a bureaucrat to be from Istanbul. It wasn't a thing, right? But with the advent of the state came state-run services, and with state-run services come state-employed bureaucrats, and that's why this problem emerges. And it's a totally accidental problem. It's not one that you really foresee coming, right? Like, while you're thinking of these fantastical modernization campaigns, it's not really something that you consider. But prior to this, no, it wasn't really an issue. If you were going to go to a place, you probably took a translator with you or something like that. Oh, khalas, yeah, you're fine. Like, not really a huge deal. Of course, there was a generation of people like Yusuf Diya al-Khalidi who spoke Ottoman Turkish and who spoke Arabic. But like, these were a privileged few. But did that answer your question? Yeah, because like prior to this, no, it was a non-issue. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum. This was very informative and beautiful sessions being conducted. And I really like the final thoughts you have put up, that mashallah, that we are very optimistic and inshallah things would get better. And we also see that context of unity among the Muslim Ummah and the different governments around there is not that captive as it should have been done for Palestine, so to say, right now, what's happening out there. So we, as common people out here, not being in the governments and democracies and all that, but what do you think, beside doing dua and beside discussing all these and making our hearts alive with the situation which is happening there with our Muslim brothers and sisters, what else do you think could be a good idea beside pushing this information out there to our new generation? Yeah.
A fantastic question. So the brother was asking, what do I think that the Ummah can do, particularly for Palestine, given that we are common people, we are not our governments. We are neither this government, alhamdulillah, we're not this government, and we are not representatives of the governments of our ancestral homelands, right? So my entire 90-minute talk at SFU last week after my session here was on this subject. So I'm not going to give a 90-minute talk. I will say this. Number one, if you are responding to crises around the world, you are already too late. And I don't mean that like give up, don't do anything, khalas, wash your hands of it. I mean the work needs to start before the crisis happens. So in the case of Palestine, typically how things work is this. And by the way, for those who don't know, I'm a Palestinian. And the podcast that I do is primarily on Palestinian history, Ottoman history, but a history of Ottoman Palestine. So this war is not my first rodeo. I have seen before where a lot of people get really enthusiastic and they say, brother, what can I do to help? How can I get involved? Send me some books. What should I read? All of these things. And then the war ends and it's not on the news. And now India is playing Pakistan in cricket and a new World Cup is happening and there's Champions League soccer and there's, Allahu A'lam what, this or that or this or that. And people stop paying attention. Okay, so number one, people need to continue paying attention when things are not on the news. Number two, and this is so important, and I actually forgot to mention this at SFU. I have been something of an activist since I was a teenager. I had many activists with me. How many of them do you think are still with me? Like in this, public work, either in the work of public education, like this I consider a type of activism. How many of them, of the original core group that I had with me in university, how many of them do you think are still active in these spaces? Wala wahad, zero, none, not one. Because fulan became a doctor, so-and-so became a pharmacist, so-and-so became an engineer, so-and-so became a dentist. When I'm saying so-and-so, I'm imagining real people, okay? I have these people like in my head. And the tragedy is even more amplified with our sisters. You go to an MSA right now and you find that it's overwhelmingly dominated with very active young sisters. But then they get married and they have a few kids. And then now suddenly life gets very busy. Right? This is one of the reasons why, I'm just going to go on a small rant here for a moment. Probably starting next week, I will be giving a 3-part Palestine 101 lecture at the Mac Center. And they asked me, what conditions do you have? And I told them, my first and foremost condition, non-negotiable, absolutely non-negotiable, you must provide childcare. Because if you do not have childcare, either the children are going to run amok, which the brothers and sisters from MAC, they know there's a lot of young children, which I don't mind. But more likely when you tell the sisters you can't bring their kids, do you think the sisters come and they leave their kids at home? What do you think you're saying when you say don't bring your kids? You're saying, inti kaman, don't come. You also are not welcome, right? So if we want our sisters to remain involved in our work, and we want to continue having them active in our spaces, we need childcare. It's a must, it's non-negotiable. Okay, so now we have people coming, we have people attending, and how much time do I have? Perfect, okay, inshallah I can do this in 4 minutes. We need active education that is not just responding to the current war that we are watching. There's one. We need raising of funds to be able to help people who are negatively affected by their activism. People are losing their jobs for speaking about Palestine, right or wrong, right? People are losing their jobs all across this country. So wouldn't it be nice to know if there was a reserve that you can tap into, right? To know that I'm going to have, $100 check a month, $1,000, a whole other job lined up, perhaps. If I lose this job for speaking about Palestine, I don't care, I have this reserve to tap into. We have no shortage of doctors. We have no shortage of dentists. We have no shortage of pharmacists and engineers and high-tech blah, 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 blah. Brothers and sisters who have more money than they have time. So they might say, I cannot attend your events, I cannot learn, I cannot do all of these things, but here is money. Do with it as you please. These are just like 2 or 3 quick things, right? Immediate things, but it will not work to help with this war now. You start doing this now to help the brothers and sisters when the next war happens. Right? All the work that we do now, with our generation right now, the generation that's coming up, we do it to protect ourselves the next war. Everything that you're seeing today, all of this, this was created by the Bush administration. This. This is 15 years of responding to the American invasion of Iraq. You put in the work to create the change down the road, not in the same day. Any other questions?